2, I wanted to kind of set the expectation for why are we learning about basic angles and trig functions? And the answer is because when we start moving into different coordinate planes, because we're headed towards that spherical three-dimensional ability, we actually get there by passing through what we call the polar coordinate system. And so we have to review angles and trig functions because we're actually going to utilize those to describe points, lines, and imagery that we can create in the polar graph plane. So that's part of why there's this week 1 and 2 intro to some basic, really mathematical concepts, is because that's what we're looking at. And one of the interesting things that happens in polar is because these trig functions cycle, it creates some really interesting pictures. So if I'm in what we call the rectangular coordinate plane, and that's probably the one that you're familiar with from high school, you'll notice that we have these nice waves and that it's got kind of a lulling smoothness to it. But if we really think about how this is going to translate later on to the polar plane, these nice predictable waves, they cycle between 1 and -1. And so basically, it's like an infinite number of circles that are being formed in the polar graph, because the polar graph is actually going to graph the pattern itself and not actually see this oscillation. So we want to be familiar with what these graphs look like in the rectangular plane, because that's going to come into play into what they look like in polar and then as we sketch them on a sphere. So this week we are really going to complete an investigation in addition to what you've learned, and we're going to start moving things around to make some really nice imagery. And so in your assignment, you're going to do things like, let's do this, but let's add 2. What happens? Well, you'll notice when I added 2, the graph, it went up 2. We might also say that I want to do x minus 1. And you'll notice that x minus 1, all of my points have shifted by 1. We may want to do something like 5x. And if I do 5x, you see a lot more compressed waves. And so as you're completing that investigation this week, you're noticing how do these patterns respond to changes in equations, and we're going to work towards building a really cool image based off of these nice patterns and waves that happen. And so really this week is about, can you find the values on the unit circle using the unit circle? So I don't expect you to memorize that at all. I expect you to have that printed out next to you for the knowledge check. And then really just playing with these curves. And if I want to add another curve to it, I just click below and I can add another one. So let's say I want to add cosine of x. And you'll see that it's automatically going to assign different colors. Now, if you want to change the color of the graph, I can hide them this way. I can click on the lines. I can add new points. I can shift these colors by adjusting my settings. I can do a lot of different things in here. And so as you're graphing, you'll be able to see that it'll create these different colors that you can then go in and edit as you want to edit the colors here. You can also shift it around if you want to see some examples of things. They've got some native examples in Desmos. If you click settings, that's how you can change the color. So if I want this to be purple, I can click done. If I want to change that blue, I just click settings and I'm going to change that. So really this week is about kind of figuring the pattern out of how we change the equation and how that affects the visual, because that's going to help you understand when we move to polar, what creates these beautiful roses, what creates these beautiful flowers, shells. There's a lot of really cool graphs that are generated, but it all has to do with the behavior of the graph in the rectangular coordinate plane, which is XY, which you've been learning pretty much your whole mathematic career. So that's the connection between this week and how it connects to where we're headed. As we're looking ahead, a couple of things that you might find useful is investing in some balloons. So as we move into that 3D spherical in the second part of the semester, you're going to want to be able to draw on a spherical surface, which is very hard to do. And so a lot of the times I will do it on a balloon. So I'll have a colored balloon and I'll sketch with my Sharpie, and that's kind of how I'm able to do that. So that's where we're headed. But to get there, we have to pass through understanding polar, which we need to understand angles and trig functions before we can understand polar. We're going to explore polar and all the beautiful images you can make there, and then we'll move through into the 3D spherical stuff. So it's a week of basics, but it's definitely a worthwhile week of basics where you're going to gain a lot of knowledge that's going to help you in those later sections.